Virtual reality is the wild west of gaming, as its history has been very rough with a lot of ups and downs. However, amongst the struggling is a golden period known as Prime VR, which was when virtual reality was at its most popular. It's long gone now, however many look back on it with a sense of nostalgia, seeing it as perfect. But why was this? Well, to me, it's because every major VR game at the time came together to form sort of a perfect selection. Unlike the normal game market, where everything is competing with each other and savage AAA companies are going crazy, VR was quiet, existed within a bubble with only a few passionate developers all working in synergy to create the perfect variety of games, so that there was something for everyone. But what are these games and how do they contribute to Prime VR? That's what this video is about. Gorilla Tag making its third appearance on the channel, and hopefully last because this thing gives me sleep paralysis, is the first VR game many will play, and acts as a sort of entrance to the VR world. Firstly, this is because it targets kids with its bright colours and mascots, which activate the neurons in the brain, and also its simple gameplay of just playing tag is ripe for potential of funny moments. Now, if you know one thing about the internet, it's that most successful pieces of media are things that target kids or have large child audiences, because most of the internet is made up of literal infants.
Who remembers the Infinity Stones?
So because of this, Gorilla Tag became viral with a large fan base. However, most of the fan base only watched it on YouTube than actually play the game, as the amount of people who actually owned a VR headset was rather low. And it's not like these kids could get a headset because they're kids, they're broke, they don't have any money. And outside birthdays, the only exception to this was Christmas, which was infamous for how new gens would flood the lobby every year on the day, as a batch of kids here would get themselves an Oculus Quest 2. The Quest 2 was revolutionary for being an actually affordable VR headset that was also standalone, unlike other headsets which required a gaming PC, making the cost of entering VR increase with about 600 something. Now you just needed an Oculus Quest 2 to enter VR. So when I'm talking about the VR bubble in this video, I'm specifically referring to more so the Oculus Quest 2 side of virtual reality, as that's what's most popular and what people know Prime VR as. Now, the role Gorilla Tag served in Prime VR, aside from being a starting point, would also to be to act as a hub for VR of sorts. As you see, Gorilla Tag is a very multi-purpose game. If you want to play competitively, you can do that. If you want to chill out, there's a good community. If you want to hunt eldritch horrors, yes, that's in the game too for some reason. So any player can play the game in any mood, unlike most other games where they demand a very specific mood if you want to play. So if you're not up for that, you can just come here. Whilst it can be debated how good Gorilla Tag is as a game, as a function of virtual reality, it's undeniable, getting VR popular, starting many YouTube careers, and having a very consistent stream of updates, all things needed for a long-lasting game that VR titles very much lacked before. Rec Room is another game that also has that can be played in any mood type feel to it, as it's basically the Roblox of VR. Users make their own games for other users to play, so naturally it's basically an entire catalogue of games within one, therefore the multiple moods. It also filled areas of the VR space that Gorilla Tag could not, as at the time Gorilla Tag had one developer, a low amount of updates and a pretty small scope, therefore the community had to carry. But Rec Room on the other hand had an infinite amount of replayability with its Roblox-like setup. Rec Room had a major flaw to it, however, that in a way actually helped it, being that it was a lot less appealing to the infants, having more menus making it more complicated and therefore less accessible, and lacking a colourful mascot, unlike Gorilla Tag. However, losing out on a child audience actually proved a good thing in the end, as it helped Rec Room stand out and be a bit more unique, having a slightly more mature audience. I say slightly because it's still a bunch of kids just slightly older kids, which isn't that much better, but it at least made it have its own community. Again, serving as a backup to Gorilla Tag, as anyone who didn't want to really play Gorilla Tag because the community was a bit too,
I'm sorry.
infantile, could come here. So for this I call it the heart of Prime VR, as whilst Gorilla Tag was the face that kept up appearances, Rec Room was what kept pumping and supporting everything from the inside. The tone of Rec Room was also perfect, still being decently colourful, but not as colourful as something like Gorilla Tag because we're targeting older kids here, which is perfect too because the game's aesthetic is that of a high school, college, university thing, which obviously connects to the audience because older kids, that's where they're at most of the time. Rec Room is one of the games that fell off the hardest since Prime VR ended. Why? I don't know, I'm not part of the Rec Room community, but the point is many say the game is kind of dead. And people miss dead things, and people miss Prime VR. They associate it with better times, nostalgia and that. And this nostalgia and how it fuses with the connection the player has to the school aesthetic of the game creates one of the strongest symbols of Prime VR. What I mean by that is the tune of Rec Room and the images of its lobby being one of the strongest symbols of the era, almost like a mascot to it. Because Rec Room isn't exactly the peak of Prime VR, at least not for most people, however it's one of the first things people are going to think of when they think of the era, therefore it's a mascot. Which is ironic considering the reason Rec Room lacked behind Gorilla Tag in the first place is for lack of one. But if Rec Room is targeting a slightly more mature audience than Gorilla Tag with older kids, then what's the layer above that, something targeting teens and young adults? If you didn't have a space for older communities, then the VR bubble would fall apart. You can have kids to make your place popular, but you can't rely on them for long-term success. You need a more mature area. Well, that need is fulfilled in the VR space by several games in fact, the most notorious of which being vrchat. vrchat is by no means an adult-centric game, as there's a whole range of ages in its servers. However, unlike Gorilla Tag and Rec Room that are supposed to appeal to them darn youth, vrchat is very much intended for a more mature audience. Mainly through its concept, as it's a lot like Rec Room in that the community creates the content through the game. However, unlike Rec Room, there's a lot more freedom in what you can do, such as your avatar can be literally everything, making it more mature, as you can choose to be a Teletubby or Sans from Undertale with a giant dong. However, this has the side effect of attracting kids even more so, even though it's the selling point that attracts the more mature audience, as through the millions of avatars means millions of potential mascots to attract kids, and even more so than Gorilla Tag, mascots including Ugandan Knuckles, the brushes, both becoming signatures of that corner of the internet. The game being the most popular outside the VR bubble, surpassing anything within it. However, within the Oculus Quest 2 community, it's around on par with the others in terms of player base. Back to the kids though, this creates a huge issue, as having 12-year-olds here for the mascots in the same room as all these mature avatars like Sans of a Dong violates probably a billion laws, and it's made worse by genuine predators and creeps that roam the place. Such levels of degeneracy being exclusive to VRchat, giving it a worse rep. For this it's become a bit of a black sheep within the VR world, but on the bright side of things, the freedom of avatars and worlds allows for more freedom of expression, making the communities that inhabit VRchat be a lot deeper than any of the other games, making VRchat more so a virtual universe within itself. From the virtual wrestling communities.
Hey, listen, both of you, bro. I ain't gonna lie, gangs. Both of y'all need to shut the fuck up, bro. Like, holy fuck.
They call me a fucking nigga.
To the virtual bar communities, the place is expansive, which leads into another reason why VRchat is a bit of a black sheep in the VR world, as becoming a hardcore player of it is a lot more difficult, because the communities are more closed off and hidden within its worlds. Basically, if you want to become a proper VRchat player, you have to dedicate a lot more time to it than other VR games, which makes it uniquely memorable. The area of VRchat everyone will gravitate to varies heavily from person to person, so everyone's experience is a lot more personalised, making the friends you make here and the ambience you journey through, whilst not particularly too iconic as a part of Prime VR, feel a lot more special. Now, all the games I've talked about so far are all games that aren't really actual games, more so relying on the social aspect than anything, but now we arrive at Echo VR, the fourth game in the big four of VR. There's no chance for chit chat here, you have to be locked in with the VR football in space with a frisbee gameplay, which makes it easier to jump into as you don't have to rely on finding a good space of people, just be focused on getting that frisbee in the goal. But it is also hard to get into for new VR users due to the complexity and the motion sickness the game might induce. So I call it the bridge of VR worlds, as when your first Echo VR phase hits, it's usually a sign that you've become a proper VR player. Now, as a part of Prime VR, Echo VR arguably has one of the most tragic parts, for the game got shut down. It will never fall off like the other games did, but rather frozen in time as a symbol of the glory days. It is here we are reminded that all of this is a long gone era. It's easy to talk about Prime VR and forget that it's never coming back, which is kind of the point. It wouldn't be Prime VR if it weren't gone. It's nostalgic, a shared nostalgia that we feel for the era, that is what makes it so strong. And this applies to many things, mainly popular games like Minecraft, as everyone has played that, so everyone can bond over it as a shared experience. So nostalgia for niche stuff only really happens rarely, which is ironic because nostalgia for niche stuff is debatably one of the better feelings of nostalgia, because it feels more personal. However, Prime VR is relatively niche in the grand scheme of things, and yet nostalgia for it is rather common. So why is that? Well, it's because of the VR bubble, as by all the VR games being contained within a bubble with a community instead of being lost in the sea of other video game marketplaces, it allows the community to be more focused and centralized, instead of being scattered all around the place, so a shared sense of nostalgia is more easily to come by through that. So Prime VR nostalgia is both common and really feel good. Therefore, perfect. Therefore, by that logic, Prime VR is the friends we made along the way, and I'm not even taking the piss, because Prime VR is only Prime VR because of the community that made it big. The community that we can talk about the nostalgia of the memories of the time with. You can go back and play any of these Prime VR games now, except for Echo VR of course, but it wouldn't be the same because again, it was that golden community that just came together so well that what made it so peak. So now with Echo VR gone, that nostalgic memories are all we have left of the game, now that it's lost. Shoutouts to Ori on Drift though, a game made by the devs of Gorilla Tag that is intended to carry on the legacy and gameplay of Echo VR. That's pretty awesome. It shows a ray of hope as it's quite a good game, and also a sign that a new VR resurgence could be soon. Speaking of resurgences, most good pieces of media is just something pre-existing with a twist to it. Alien is just Jaws in space, Subnautica is the typical survival but underwater. It's a key to success, as by basing something of something pre-existing, you put yourself in a pre-existing bubble that already has an audience that will interact with your piece of media, but the twist is what keeps it unique and helps it to stand out from whatever you're basing your stuff on. And VR is perfect for this, as VR in itself is the twist. Just make any type of game in VR and boom, you've done your formula. Pavlov is just that, the shooter genre in VR. There is no need to explain why this works, it just works. The physical reloading and ducking for cover is something that's unique to VR, and it creates some pretty good stuff. Now, alongside serving the need for a shooter game in the VR space, it also serves the need for a proper adult game in the VR space, as outside of edgy kids, I'm looking at you Kieran, the main player base of these games are people who are big on shooters before getting a VR. Now, taking things back a bit, we have Call of Duty. It's very much a game with a similar community of nostalgia surrounding it that passed away to corporate greed. I mean, what is Call of Duty even about nowadays? And many try and recreate that Call of Duty legacy within their own new games, but it never works because they don't have a twist to it that makes it unique. They're just trying to recreate Call of Duty, but it'll never be good as the original because it's nothing but a recreation, a facade of it. However, for some, that need for a new Call of Duty was filled with Pavlov and its VR twist. It's never replacing Call of Duty, but that's just because it's its own thing. It's not Call of Duty replacement number 567, it's Pavlov, and it just so happens to also fulfill that need for another COD. Examples of resurgences like this are all over VR. Gorilla Tag in itself was made as a copy of Echo VR, just with its primate twist to it. And the recent Orion Drift could have easily just been an attempt at recreating what Echo VR had, but clutched up by adding several twists to its gameplay to make it unique, as well as even more game modes that in itself are twists to old classic stuff, like death run modes and parkour. Almost everything is a resurgence. Gorilla Tag is just a resurgence of old internet monkey memes, Rec Room is a resurgence of the Roblox style of formula, everything is a resurgence of things that were looked back in the past with nostalgia, and now that it's proved itself, Prime VR is now the thing that is looked back with in nostalgia, as we all hope maybe it will have a resurgence of its own one day. Now, online games tend to get the most rep as being the most important part of Prime VR, as they have communities that can talk about them with nostalgia. However, online experiences alone could never carry the VR bubble, as not everyone is an online person. Many prefer story games, so virtual reality's several story games are an important part of the bubble that don't really get the credit they deserve, so let me shine a light on them for a moment. Story games naturally predate most of the major online VR games and were responsible for VR's early initial booms, with all the big Let's Players like DanTDM playing them. Games like Job Simulator and Superhot being icons of this 2016 era, made by the first developers who started utilising VR's potential. This brief popularity never really got used to its full advantage, as the Quest 2 wasn't around, so the high entry price pushed most away. Those who did play wouldn't really stick around either because the VR bubble wasn't here, so there wasn't really a good selection of games to keep people around. Story games would keep struggling over the years with many ups and downs, only kept afloat by a few content creators giving them views like Wolf in VR. Occasionally a goddamn masterpiece would drop, like the infamous Boneworks or my personal favourite virtual reality, but again the high entry costs would block out these. Then when the Prime VR boom happened, these story games would continue to be blocked out by the online games, the player base of Prime VR either being kids too young to comprehend a story game or not really being story game people like Pavlov's player base. The only way story games ended up getting any sort of major popularity is through word of mouth, like people talking about them over Oculus Quest calls or using brand IPs like Walking Dead, Saints and Sinners. Both marketing of word of mouth and through use of brand IPs being things synonymous with OG video game culture, making another example of resurgence. It's hard to talk about them as just like vrchat, it's very personalised to the player, with each user of a Quest 2 having their own selection of story games that will be nostalgic to them. From I Expect You to Die to Song in Smoke, it varies heavily. If there's one takeaway I want to give you from this video, it's to go out there and actually play some Quest 2 story games, and don't play the obvious stuff. Have a look around the store and see if you can find some underrated gems that appeal to you. There is one story game, however, that rised above the rest and reached heights of popularity that it even beat most of the online games at one time. However, its release would also mark the end of Prime VR for some. I'm talking about Bone Lab. Bone Lab was a new game by the creators of Boneworks, but this time was made for the Quest 2. The hype for it was unreal and natural too, both Boneworks players excited for a sequel and Quest players who saw this hype and got excited themselves. And the build for its release was like nothing ever seen before, the trailers picked apart with their marketing on top. That might be the reason most story games fumbled, no marketing, but Bone Lab had a community ready to play it before it even released. The golden formula to Bone Lab is that it had everything. Most of the time when a game tries to do everything at once, it ends up failing, as the best games are ones that focusing on what it knows it's good at, but Bone Lab was just good at everything, which is kind of a miracle for gaming. It had combat that brought in the Pavlov community, modding and customization that brought in the vrchat community, a memorable aesthetic like Rec Room, and YouTuber-like virality for the Gorilla Tag community. Release night was the stuff. It felt like a resurgence of the days when I'd stay up for a gaming event that were long gone due to the gaming drought that the time was in, but we were so back here. And then the game released, and Boneworks players were disappointed as the game was not on the level of Boneworks, being downsized to fit on the Quest, and the game was rather complicated, which was a slap in the face to some of the younger audiences excited for the game. So that's a chunk of the community that took quite the hit, but the rest of the community had a great time. However, it was enough of a letdown for some to not fill the space in the VR bubble it needed to, and Prime VR only worked because of its structure and everything working in sync, so remove one piece and everything fell apart. It's not like Bone Lab single-handedly kills Prime VR, but it brought the mood of the room down, so other events like Echo VR's shutdown or Gorilla Tag's slow period had a lot more of an impact on the community, making it so people's Quest 2s eventually started being left off for longer. Ironic considering Bone Lab's world is set in a metaverse with no users. Life is always thriving in VR, and there's lots of little Prime VRs going on at any time, like Orion Drift is having its own success, and vrchat is having a resurgence in the mainstream with its trolling community, but everything working together perfectly like in Prime VR is long gone and it's not coming back. At least not in the same way. However you put it, there is a space missing for something, anything to step up to begin the next generation of VR. Just please, as a community, don't give up on VR no matter how long this takes.